was a Thursday of perfect English character, cloudless, temperate, and fragrant with roses. In the village of Chipping Dean, this meant one thing: the monthly meeting of the garden club. The venue was the vicarage garden, where tidy lawns, unrolled like a green carpet beneath rows of parasols and tables with linen cloths, lemon drizzle cake, and bone china teacups. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Isabel Cartwright, presided with nervous energy, assisted by her long-suffering niece Julia. The club's members, mostly women of a certain age and social standing, chatted about dahlias and marrows with the solemnity of parliamentarians. Miss Jane Marple sat on a white-painted bench near the rose border, wearing her customary straw hat and fingerless lace gloves. She listened, smiled, and quietly observed. "I do hope the judges take into account the slugs," said Mrs. Ramsbottom, who had once lost a best-in-show cucumber to mollusks and never quite recovered. "We've had a dreadful season for them. They take into account nothing," muttered Major Baxter, retired from the Indian Army and seemingly from joy itself. "All a conspiracy, if you ask me. That Amelia Farrow wins every year. Might as well engrave her name in advance. Amelia Farrow. Herself, a widow of imposing elegance and ruthlessly pruned hydrangeas, merely offered a brittle smile." She turned to Julia Cartwright, who was pouring tea. "Dear girl, would you be a love and fetch another spoon? This one appears to have a chip." Julia smiled, nodded, and turned toward the house, only to pause as a young woman in a plain black dress and white apron emerged from the French doors of the vicarage, holding a silver tray. "Oh," Julia said, blinking. "I thought, how strange. We weren't expecting help from the agency today." The maid was unfamiliar. Pretty, pale and slim, with dark eyes that didn't quite match the meek posture she adopted. She moved among the guests like a shadow. Only Miss Marple watched her closely. "You're new," said Mrs. Ramsbottom sharply as the girl offered her a plate of shortbread. "I thought Isabel only used Miss Pettigrew on Thursdays." The maid lowered her eyes. "Miss Pettigrew was unwell, madam." Mrs. Ramsbottom sniffed, but accepted a biscuit. "Odd," murmured Julia, returning with another spoon. "I didn't receive any message." The maid, if she heard, didn't respond. She continued moving about the lawn, silent and efficient. Most of the guests had forgotten her entirely by the time the judging began. It wasn't until 20 minutes later, as tea was wrapping up and the cups were being collected, that anyone noticed the scream. It came from the vicarage hallway. Julia, who had just gone inside, appeared in the doorway seconds later, white as parchment. Someone's fallen," she gasped. In the study, Miss Marple rose without haste but with purpose. Behind her, chairs scraped and parasols tilted as the guests surged with morbid interest. In the vicar's study, where dust motes danced lazily through sunbeams, the scene was jarringly still. Slumped behind the desk was Mr. Graham Hepworth, Amelia Farrow's longtime solicitor and judge of the garden club, his head lolled to one side. A teacup sat beside him, untouched, but cracked. The silver tea tray had been knocked to the floor. Dr. Leonard Finch, summoned by a boy on a bicycle, arrived within 20 minutes and confirmed what no one had said aloud. "Poison," he muttered, gravely after checking the bluish lips and cooling skin. "Likely quick acting. We'll need an autopsy, of course, but this wasn't natural." The room was silent, except for Mrs. Cartwright's stifled sobs and the murmur of villagers gathering just outside. "I'll phone Inspector Cray from Much Wycombe," said Dr. Finch. "We mustn't touch anything until the authorities arrive." Miss Marple stood near the doorway, eyes thoughtful, voice gentle. "Forgive me, but where is the maid? The one no one expected." A hush followed. Julia's face turned ashen. I don't know. She was just here." But the girl in the black dress and white apron had vanished, along with her silver tray and every trace of her presence. The vicarage garden emptied slowly, as if the crisp June air had thickened with the weight of something awful. The villagers dispersed in clumps, whispering along hedgerows and glancing back at the shuttered French doors. The sun remained bright, indifferent to the fact that Mr. Graham Hepworth, solicitor, rose judge, pillar of Chipping society, was lying lifeless inside. Miss Marple, ever unhurried, walked along the gravel path with her parasol now closed, and resting against her shoulder like a shepherdess's crook. She did not rush. One must never rush after a murder, not when so many are inclined to speak too quickly in its aftermath. She paused at the edge of the vicarage lawn and turned to Julia Cartwright, who stood like a statue near the steps, arms folded tightly across her bodice. "My dear," said Miss Marple softly, "perhaps you might let the inspector know about the maid. I have found, over the years, that the people who aren't where they're supposed to be often have rather interesting reasons." Julia blinked, as though awoken from a dream. Yes, of course, I'll tell him." Miss Marple nodded and turned away, her eyes glancing once more at the patch of broken crockery on the vicarage rug, barely visible through the window. The sunlight streamed in innocently, golden and clean, belying the quiet violence that had occurred inside. By evening, Inspector Archibald Cray had arrived from Much Wycombe in a rather dented Morris 8. He was a large man with a receding hairline and a persistent frown, as if life had failed to meet his expectations, but had the gall to go on anyway. The villagers, respectful of officialdom but ever hungry for gossip, watched as he entered the vicarage with the authority of someone used to dealing with drunkards and domestic quarrels, not refined murder in a drawing room. By twilight, the town was buzzing. "You mark my words," said Mrs. Ramsbottom at her front gate, addressing an invisible jury. It was deliberate. Hepworth was poking too closely into old matters. "I heard he was sorting out Amelia Farrow's will, and she's got more skeletons in her closet than the churchyard's got bones." "Rubbish," muttered Major Baxter from his garden next door. "If anyone killed him, it was young Julia. That girl's got secrets behind those big eyes. Don't trust anyone who flinches at a teaspoon." The shops closed early. Curtains twitched later than usual. At the Red Hart Inn, speculation flowed faster than the ale. And somewhere amid all this noise, Miss Marple sat quietly in her drawing room, needle in hand, listening to the wireless, but not really hearing it. Her thoughts were elsewhere. It was not the poison that interested her most. Poison was sadly common, particularly among the genteel. Nor was it the solicitor's role, though that too bore scrutiny. No, it was the maid. A maid who appeared on no roster, who offered no name, and who moved among the guests like a wisp of smoke. That was not coincidence. That was design. At 9:30, a knock came at the cottage door. It was Julia, eyes tired, hair hastily pinned. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple. I didn't know who else to speak to." "Not at—" "Oh dear, come in, sit down." Miss Marple gestured to a chair beside the fire. "Would you like some tea, or something stronger?" "Tea, please, if it's not too much trouble." In truth, Julia looked as though she might never sleep again. Miss Marple busied herself with the kettle, then settled beside her guest, offering a delicate floral cup and saucer. "I haven't told Inspector Cray everything," Julia admitted after a moment. "I don't know why. I suppose I didn't want him to think I was involved." "People often feel that way," said Miss Marple kindly. "Truth has an awkward shape when it reflects on us." Julia nodded. "The maid, she wasn't on the schedule, no. But she said Miss Pettigrew was ill, and I believed her. She looked the part, so neat, so calm. Not like the girls you sometimes get from the agency who forget things or look frightened by their own shadows. She seemed capable." "Did she give her name?" "No." Julia's brow furrowed. "That's what's so strange. I didn't. realize it until afterward. She just arrived, and no one else asked. Mrs. Ramsbottom did, but the girl replied smoothly. Miss Pettigrew was unwell, and that was that. Miss Marple stirred her tea, her eyes distant. Tell me, my dear, did she seem familiar to you at all? Even vaguely? Julia hesitated. Maybe. Her voice, perhaps. Not the sound of it, but the way she spoke, like she was used to giving orders rather than taking them. But no, I wouldn't say I'd seen her before. I see. And Mr. Hepworth did. He speak to her? Did he notice her? I don't think so. He kept mostly to himself during tea. He was going over notes for the judging. He took it rather seriously, you know. He went inside early, just before the awards were announced. Miss Marple nodded again. And you? I followed him in about 10 minutes later to fetch the ribbons and prize cards. That's when I found him. Julia's hands tightened around her cup. It's my fault. I should have... Now, Miss Marple said gently. Don't trouble yourself with guilt. It has a tendency to mask the truth more than reveal it. And I rather think you are more help to justice than hindrance. Julia gave a watery smile. You always say things that sound simple but feel clever. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Age, my dear. It's just age. One sees a great many things in a village over the years, enough to recognize a pattern when it starts to form. Julia looked at her, then away. Do you think the maid was the one who poisoned him? I think, Miss Marple replied, that she did not arrive by accident, and that she was not here to serve tea. That may amount to the same thing. Later, when Julia had gone, and the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock, Miss Marple sat in her parlour and made a note on a small slip of paper. The maid, voice of command, borrowed role, familiar air. Below it, she scribbled a single word, actress. The next morning, the village woke with new rumours and a renewed sense of unease. Inspector Cray had begun formal interviews. The vicarage was now sealed, and the body removed to Much Wycombe for post-mortem. Amelia Farrow, whose name had been on many lips the day before, had now secluded herself in her ivy-covered home at the top of Church Hill. And yet it was not Amelia, nor Julia, nor even the vicar's distraught wife that occupied Miss Marple's mind. It was the absence of a single item, not the maid herself, but her tray, silver, old, and engraved on the handles, too distinctive to vanish quietly, unless someone wanted it to, the silver tray. It haunted Miss Marple's thoughts the way a faint melody might, one half remembered but persistent, always just on the edge of recall. She could picture it clearly now, oval, polished to a quiet sheen, engraved with a floral crest, one that had struck her as vaguely familiar. That tray had held the cups and the small scones and the fatal tea that Graham Hepworth had sipped from with such absent-minded confidence. And now, as though swallowed by the earth, it was nowhere to be found. The official story, at least from Inspector Cray's perspective, was taking shape along more traditional lines. He had questioned Julia again that morning, and then had made his way, grumbling audibly about early hours and overzealous gardeners, to speak with Mrs. Farrow, who had refused to open the door. The villagers, used to their own rhythms and routines, took to gathering in little knots near the grocer's or at the war memorial, heads pressed together in whispered conference. Miss Marple did not participate in the gossip. She rarely did. Instead, she dressed carefully, in a dove-grey blouse and a modest skirt with pearl buttons, and made her way up Church Hill with a walking stick she didn't strictly need. Her destination, Amelia Farrow's ivy-covered cottage, Lavender End. Miss Farrow, the oldest surviving member of a family once grand, was something of a relic herself. She had served in the Women's Royal Naval Service during the Great War, had kept a driver and a Persian cat in better days, and now lived alone with a housekeeper whose hearing had deteriorated into cheerful uselessness. Miss Marple rang the bell precisely twice. Not 3. 3 sounded impatient. 2 was genteel. Eventually the door opened a crack. Amelia Farrow's face peered through, pale as milk and sharp as a blade. "Jane Marple," she said flatly. "What a surprise, though I suppose nothing truly is any more." "I was out walking," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "And I thought, since you've been under such strain, well, a little company and perhaps a boiled sweet." She produced a small, paper-wrapped parcel from her handbag. "Amelia's." Expression twitched, then relented. "You always did know how to disarm a fortress, Jane." The door creaked open. Miss Marple stepped inside. Lavender End smelled of beeswax, dust, and faintly of orange blossom. The sitting room was tidy but not untouched. An open book rested on the arm of a chair, and a glass of sherry stood unfinished on a side table. The cat was not in sight, though Miss Marple imagined it lurked under some imposing piece of furniture, staring balefully at intruders. "I suppose you want to talk about Graham," Amelia said, once they were seated. "The whole village does. Always found him rather exacting," said Miss Marple, placing her gloves delicately on her lap, "but courteous, a man of tidy habits." Amelia snorted. "You'd need tidy habits to survive this village, drowning in secrets and garden fates." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed, sipping the tea Amelia had offered, lukewarm and overly steeped. "And yet, things have a way of surfacing in time. You were very close with him, weren't you?" "Close? No." Amelia set down her cup too hard, and some of the tea sloshed over the rim. "We shared a past. That's all. When you live long enough, everyone becomes part of the furniture." "But he was handling your will, I believe?" Amelia's eyes flickered. "That's no secret. I'd had a fright. An illness a few months ago made me consider things." "I understand completely," Miss Marple said gently. "And I believe he also handled the affairs of the late Colonel Pritchard?" Now there was a pause. "I don't see what that has to do with anything," Amelia said coldly. "Oh, nothing directly, I'm sure," Miss Marple replied. "Only I recall the Colonel had rather a collection of curiosities. Silver, I believe. And I had the oddest sense, at the garden party, of having seen a tray that once belonged to him." The silence sharpened. "You noticed all that?" Amelia said finally. "One sees things," said Miss Marple with her characteristic modesty. "Even at my age." Amelia stood up. "Well, if you're here to ask whether I brought a murderer into Julia Cartwright's garden party, I can't help you. I barely left my chair. I didn't see the tray, and if I had, I doubt I'd remember. Dozens of those things exist." Miss Marple rose too, with a slight wobble of effort. "Yes, quite. Still, it's rather odd how the little things vanish in a murder. People notice blood and bodies. But the tea tray, that disappears, almost as if someone planned it." Amelia's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Miss Marple let herself out with a polite farewell. Outside, the wind had picked up. The high hedges rustled like whispering voices. As Miss Marple descended the hill, her thoughts were more focused, now narrowing around a peculiar idea. If the tray was Colonel Pritchard's, and if it had been used deliberately, then it wasn't simply a murder weapon. It was a message, one for someone in particular. At the greengrocer's, Miss Marple stopped briefly to examine a head of cabbage and exchanged polite words with Mr. Hooper. She asked, quite incidentally, whether any of the delivery boys had mentioned a parcel or a visitor up near Lavender End in the past week. "Parcel, yes," Mr. Hooper said. "From up in London. Special delivery, odd that. Came addressed to Miss Farrow, wrapped up like Christmas. Heavy," the boy said. Miss Marple made a note of that in her mind. That afternoon, Inspector Cray arrived unannounced at Miss Marple's cottage. He looked harried and pink in the face. "I'm not used to these sorts of cases," he admitted, seated awkwardly on her needlepoint settee. "Give me a pub brawl or a burglary, but this, poison in broad daylight right under everyone's nose." "It's difficult when the motive is concealed," Miss Marple offered, "or when the act was meant to look Impersonal. Cray shifted. You've been talking to people. I often do. Then perhaps you can explain something to me. The post-mortem came back. He leaned forward. It wasn't the tea, or at least not the tea in the cups collected afterward. We tested them all, not a trace of digitalis or anything else, but the tray itself, that's missing. Miss Marple's eyes lit faintly, though her expression remained composed. I wonder, she said thoughtfully, if the poison was placed not in the pot, nor in the cups, but in the milk jug, or sugar bowl. Something removable. Something carried off before suspicion could land. Cray blinked. That'd mean whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing, came prepared, or had planned it for quite some time. Cray stared at her for a moment. You think this was personal? I think someone used the role of a servant to commit a master's crime. That evening, back in her parlour, Miss Marple took out a piece of thick notepaper and wrote another word beneath her earlier note, stagecraft. She tapped the pen once on the wood, then added disguise. Motivation, inheritance, revenge, and finally underlined in delicate loops, who knew Hepworth's habits well enough to offer him milk, but not tea. The following morning dawned misty and cold, the kind of chill that seeped into one's bones, and made the warm hearth at Miss Marple's cottage all the more inviting. Yet for all its comfort, the cottage held no warmth for Miss Marple's thoughts, which had become as tangled as the brambles along the village lanes. The mystery of the missing tray and the cryptic role it played occupied her mind in the quiet hours before breakfast. She had been pondering the inspector's words, the certainty that the tea itself was not poisoned, but rather something peripheral, something small, easily removed. As she sipped her own morning tea, carefully prepared without fuss or ceremony, a knock came at the door. It was Julia Cartwright, her eyes shadowed and her hands clutching a neatly folded handkerchief. The tragedy weighed heavily on her, but beneath the grief was a spark of resolve. Miss Marple, she began hesitantly, I've been thinking. About the day of the party, about Graham, and about the maid. Miss Marple looked up with gentle encouragement. Please do go on. Julia folded her hands tightly in her lap. You see, when the poison was discovered, my first thought was the maid. Not because I suspected her, but because she was new. She wasn't on the schedule for the day, nor did I remember seeing her at any other time. Quite right to notice that, said Miss Marple. You said she was new. Did you know her name? Only that she called herself Anne. She arrived the day before the party, very eager and cheerful, but rather quiet about where she'd come from. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And did anyone else notice her absence before the tragedy? Julia hesitated. Mrs. Farrow mentioned something, that she didn't know the girl and that the whole thing seemed suspicious. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing just slightly. A stranger in a close-knit village often stirs the waters, especially when she appears unexpectedly. Tell me, Julia, how well did Graham know this Anne? Julia frowned. I don't think he did. He barely spoke to her. Curious, Miss Marple murmured. That afternoon, with Inspector Cray's permission, Miss Marple arranged to visit the local inn where most villagers congregated for midday meals and gossip. The Red Lion was alive with murmurs, but Miss Marple's presence seemed to draw the conversations toward the murder naturally, as if she were the gravity around which suspicion spun. Old Mr. Hargrove, the village carpenter, was the first to speak freely. That Anne girl, yes. She looked proper enough, but a bit too keen, if you ask me. Came into the village with no references, no letters of introduction. That's unusual round here. And yet, Miss Marple replied, she was allowed to work in Julia Cartwright's household without such assurances. Well, Julia's not one for questioning too hard when someone offers help, Mr. Hargrove said, taking a slow sip of his ale. Mrs. Pennington, the schoolmistress, chimed in from a nearby table. I saw her the day before the party. She was helping arrange the garden chairs. She moved quickly, almost too efficiently, like she'd done this many times before. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her handbag. Did she interact much with anyone else? Very little, Mrs. Pennington said. She kept mostly to herself, no chatter with the other servants, but she did seem to be watching Graham, Hepworth, quite closely. The room fell silent. The notion of Anne watching the victim raised more questions than answers. Outside, the grey clouds thickened, and a gentle rain began to fall. Miss Marple thanked the villagers and made her way home, pondering the threads that now seemed tangled beyond a simple motive. The mysterious maid, the missing tray, the subtle poison, not random accidents, but pieces of a carefully arranged puzzle. Back at her cottage, a letter awaited her on the doormat. The envelope was unmarked, except for a single initial, A. With delicate fingers, Miss Marple broke the seal and unfolded the note inside. Miss Marple, you look deeper than you should in this village. Stop before you uncover truths better left buried. The maid was not what she seemed. A friend. The letter sent a small shiver down her spine, yet Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with determination. Threats were merely signs that she was on the right path. The next morning, she visited the post office hoping to trace the parcel Mr. Hooper had mentioned, the mysterious delivery to Amelia Farrow. The postmistress, a prim woman with a sharp tongue, confirmed it had arrived by special courier just 3 days earlier, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Nothing more than that, the postmistress said firmly. No sender's name, no return address. Miss Marple asked about the handwriting, but the woman shrugged. Nothing special. A neat hand, but that's all. Her mind raced. Someone had taken pains to send a parcel to Amelia Farrow, and within days, Graham, Hepworth was dead. Was the package the missing link? Or merely another red herring in a village accustomed to cloaking its secrets? Later that day, Miss Marple arranged a discreet meeting with Julia Cartwright. She needed to know more about the household routines, who came and went, who was trusted, and who was kept at arm's length. Julia was frank, if weary. The household has been unsettled since Graham took over the estate's management. Staff changes, tensions rising. The servants are loyal to the family but frightened, I think. Fear can be a potent weapon, Miss Marple said softly. Julia looked at her sharply. Do you think someone here is scared enough to kill? Miss Marple gave a faint smile. Fear can prompt the most unlikely acts. But fear alone does not explain the precision of this murder. It was planned, deliberate. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. It was Mrs. Farrow, looking less austere and more vulnerable than before. I came to return a book, she said quietly, and to say, I hope you're closer to the truth than the rest of us. Miss Marple watched her carefully, noting the tremor in her hands. Thank you, Amelia. Sometimes truth is harder to find than forgiveness. As Mrs. Farrow left, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the strange little maid who wasn't on any schedule, to the missing silver tray, and to the parcel cloaked in mystery. The village had hidden depths, and she was beginning to understand the currents running beneath. Its serene surface, the pieces were coming together. Slowly, but inevitably, a pattern was emerging, and with it, a clearer image of the murderer lurking quietly among them all. The morning after Amelia Farrow's quiet visit, the village awoke to a haze that hung low and damp over the rolling fields, as if the very air was reluctant to carry the news forward. Miss Marple, for all her gentle demeanour, was resolute. She had felt the weight of Amelia's presence, the subtle shift in her once imperious manner that suggested a crack in a carefully maintained facade. After breakfast, Miss Marple set out on her usual route toward the Hepworth estate. The estate, House was an imposing stone manor, its windows like watchful eyes, reflecting the pallid sky. She noticed the gardeners already at work, their movements purposeful but cautious, as if they too felt the unease settling over the village. Miss Marple was greeted at the front door by Julia Cartwright, who looked more composed than the previous day, but still carried the traces of worry. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tinged with fatigue, "I think it's time you saw the pantry. I believe it might hold the clue you're looking for." Curious, Miss Marple followed Julia through the familiar corridors, noting how the house seemed to breathe with a quiet tension. They arrived at a modest room tucked away near the kitchen where supplies were stored and prepared before the meal service. Julia opened the door and flicked on the light, revealing neat shelves laden with jars, tins, and bottles. The air smelled faintly of herbs and old wood. "This is where the tray was prepared," Julia said softly, "where Anne worked the morning of the party." Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room with calm scrutiny, noting every detail: the half-used packet of sugar, the cracked ceramic jug, and a small wooden box, slightly ajar, on the top shelf. "May I?" she asked, stepping toward the box. Inside lay a scattering of tea leaves, dried and crushed, but also something else, a small slip of paper folded carefully. Julia looked surprised. "I never noticed that." Unfolding the paper, Miss Marple found a hastily scribbled note: "Meet me at the chapel at dusk. Come alone. The truth must not be shared." The message was unsigned, and yet it spoke volumes. Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle piece falling into place, though it only deepened the mystery. Who had written it? Who was it meant for? And why the secrecy? Before she could voice her thoughts, the door to the pantry creaked open, and Mrs. Farrow stepped inside, her expression guarded. "I thought I might find you here," she said quietly. "May I have a word?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, Amelia. You seem restless." Amelia's eyes darted around the room before settling on the note in Miss Marple's hand. "I don't know what that is," she said quickly, "but I do know that secrets have been the currency of this village for too long." Her words hung heavy in the air. Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in Amelia's voice, a hint that she was closer to the truth than she admitted. "Would you be willing to tell me everything you know about the chapel mentioned in the note?" Miss Marple asked gently. Amelia hesitated, then nodded. "It's an old building, forgotten by most. It stands on the edge of the village near the woods. No one goes there anymore, except perhaps at night. Some say it's haunted, but I believe it's where certain meetings took place long ago." "Meetings of what nature?" Miss Marple pressed. "Political, perhaps, or personal? Old grudges, old alliances? The Hepworth family has a history that isn't often spoken of." As Amelia spoke, Miss Marple's mind connected threads that had until now seemed disparate. The maid's unknown origins, the secretive parcel, and now this clandestine meeting place. She thanked Amelia and promised discretion before sending Julia to prepare for the day's errands. Alone in the pantry, Miss Marple examined the note again, tracing the handwriting with a delicate fingertip. It was hurried, anxious even, but there was a deliberate care in the formation of the letters, a care that suggested the writer was both fearful and determined. That afternoon, Miss Marple made her way toward the old chapel. The path was narrow and overgrown, the tall grass brushing her skirts as she walked with quiet purpose. The building emerged from the mist, like a relic from another age, its stone walls weathered and its stained glass windows fractured. She circled the chapel, noting a recently disturbed patch of earth near the entrance. The ground was soft from the previous night's rain, and faint footprints marked the soil, small and hurried. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of a car approaching. She looked up just as Inspector Cray arrived, his face set, in the hard lines of a man tired of the waiting game. "I thought I might find you here," he said, stepping carefully down the path. Miss Marple nodded. "I found something earlier that might interest you. A note, implying a meeting here at dusk." Inspector Cray frowned. "A meeting? Sounds like someone wanted to keep their secrets hidden in the dark." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. "And secrets are what we must uncover." Together, they explored the chapel grounds, searching for any further signs. Near the rear door, Miss Marple spotted something glinting beneath a bush, a silver pendant shaped like a small key. She picked it up carefully. Not a common trinket, she mused aloud. Likely something meant to be kept close. "Could be a clue," Cray said, pocketing the pendant. The shadows lengthened, and Miss Marple knew the village's quiet night would soon be pierced by revelation. She and the inspector returned to the manor, where Julia awaited with news. A second letter had arrived for Amelia Farrow that morning, slipped under the door with no indication of its sender. The note was short, threatening in tone, warning Amelia to cease her inquiries if she wished to remain safe. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet resolve. "This murder is no accident, Inspector. It is a carefully orchestrated silence, maintained by fear and deception." Cray nodded grimly. "But fear has a way of unraveling even the tightest threads." That evening, as dusk settled over the village, Miss Marple sat by her window, the pendant lying beside her on the table. She thought about the mysterious Anne, the missing tray, the secret meetings, and the silent threats. In the quiet, she understood that the true danger lay not just in who had the means or the motive, but in who believed they could hide behind shadows without consequence. And so the game deepened, each clue leading her closer to the truth, a truth that would soon demand confrontation, and from which no one could retreat unscathed. The next morning arrived shrouded in a thick, relentless drizzle that seemed to wash the village clean, yet left an oppressive weight clinging to the damp air. Miss Marple, seated by her sitting-room window with a steaming cup of tea, allowed her gaze to drift toward the grey outline of the Hepworth estate in the distance. The pendant lay on the table before her, a small but significant talisman that kept whispering secrets she was only beginning to understand. The Morning Post brought little comfort. A terse note from Inspector Cray, requesting a meeting at the Manor. It appeared the investigation was moving beyond whispers and shadows into a realm where the calm exterior of the village might finally crack. Upon arrival, Miss Marple found the house abuzz with activity. Julia Cartwright was visibly on edge, her usual poised demeanour fraying at the edges. The household staff moved briskly, though eyes flickered with unease whenever they thought themselves unobserved. Inspector Cray greeted Miss Marple in the drawing-room, his expression a mixture of frustration and urgency. "There's been an incident overnight," he began gravely. "One of the maids, Ellen Perkins, was found unconscious in the servants' quarters. No signs of forced entry or theft, but something's clearly not right." Miss Marple's brow furrowed, but she remained composed. "Have the doctors been summoned?" "Yes, but they say she's in a state of shock, unable to speak. It's as if she's hiding something far more frightening than injury." Julia appeared behind the inspector, clutching a small bundle of papers. "I found this in Ellen's room," she said, handing them over. The documents were letters hastily folded and bearing the same handwriting as the mysterious notes found earlier. Miss Marple unfolded one and read quietly, "You must stop digging or face the consequences. The past is buried for a reason." The tone was unmistakable, threatening yet desperate, as if the sender was caught between fear and determination. "Ellen's involvement runs deeper than we thought," Miss Marple observed. "She must have been close to uncovering something, or perhaps she already knew too much." The room fell into a contemplative silence, broken only by the distant sound of rain tapping against the window panes. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were sharp and alert, weaving connections invisible to others. "I should speak with Ellen," she said. "Even in silence, a person reveals truths in the smallest gestures." Accompanied by Cray and Julia, Miss Marple made her way to the servants' quarters, a modest wing at the rear of the estate. Ellen lay on a narrow bed, her pale face framed by dishevelled hair. The faint rise and fall of her breathing was the only sign of life in the still room. Miss Marple approached quietly, settling into a chair beside Ellen's bed. She spoke softly, recounting innocuous stories of village life and recalling shared memories. Occasionally her hand brushed Ellen's, gently encouraging recognition. After a time, Ellen's eyelids fluttered, and a weak, trembling hand reached out, grasping Miss Marple's fingers with surprising strength. It was a silent plea, a fragile bridge between isolation and trust. "I know you're frightened, dear," Miss Marple whispered, "but telling me what you know will not bring you harm." Ellen's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, and slowly she began to gesture, fragmented at first but growing more coherent. She traced circles in the air, pointed toward the pantry, and finally mimed writing and then tearing a piece of paper. Miss Marple nodded, understanding the silent language. The notes, the pantry, the secret meetings at the chapel. Cray looked on, intrigued despite himself. "Could someone be forcing her silence?" "It seems likely," Miss Marple said. "Fear is a powerful weapon, often wielded to protect the guilty." Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple reflected aloud on the implications. Ellen's distress suggests she was a witness, or perhaps an unwilling participant in something troubling. The manor's secrets run deeper than a single murder. Julia, who had been silent until now, spoke hesitantly. "There have been rumors, old family disputes, hidden grievances among the staff. Anne, the maid who disappeared the night of the party, was new and kept to herself. Perhaps she uncovered more than she intended." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Julia, noting the careful choice of words, the measured tone that skirted accusation, yet hinted at knowledge. "People often wear masks," Miss Marple mused. "The quiet ones sometimes observe most keenly." As the day wore on, news arrived that stirred the fragile calm further. A letter addressed to the village postmaster, found discarded near the chapel. It contained a cryptic warning. "My truth lies beneath the stones. Beware the roots that bind." The metaphor was clear enough, yet its meaning remained elusive. Miss Marple considered the chapel grounds, the disturbed earth, and the long-buried history Amelia Farrow had alluded to. Perhaps the answer lay not just in the living memories but in what time had tried to erase. Determined to delve deeper, Miss Marple requested a discreet search of the chapel, hoping to uncover whatever secrets lay beneath the soil. As evening descended, a small group of villagers gathered, ostensibly to aid the search but also drawn by curiosity and the irresistible pull of gossip. Among them were the tight-lipped Amelia Farrow, the calculating Julia Cartwright, and several members of the Hepworth household. With spades in hand, they carefully turned the earth near the chapel's entrance. It was slow, meticulous work, each shovelful revealing layers of damp soil and tangled roots. At length, the blade of a spade struck something hard. Excavation revealed a small, rusted tin box, its edges corroded but intact. Inside lay a collection of faded photographs, letters, and a delicate locket, bearing the same intricate key motif as the pendant Miss Marple had found. The photographs depicted a younger Hepworth family, scenes of celebration, but among them was a candid image of Anne, the missing maid, her eyes wide and wary as she stood beside a man whose face was deliberately obscured. The letters spoke of promises and betrayals, of debts owed and secrets guarded fiercely. One letter in particular caught Miss Marple's attention. It referenced a scandal that could ruin reputations, and hinted at a clandestine liaison between a member of the Hepworth family and someone far beneath their social standing. Miss Marple felt the threads tightening. The past was not just a shadow, but a living force that had shaped motives, manipulated fears, and ultimately led to murder. As the villagers absorbed the revelations, Miss Marple stood quietly apart, her mind piecing together the intricate web of human nature, pride, and desperation. She knew that soon the truth would be demanded of them all, and that in the telling some would find redemption, others ruin. But above all, the village's delicate veneer would be forever changed, and Miss Marple, as always, would watch patiently from the sidelines, ready to untangle the final knot when the time was right. The discovery of the tin box beneath the chapel sent ripples through the village, unsettling even the most stoic of residents. The faded photographs and weathered letters, unearthed after decades of silence, seemed to breathe new life into old wounds. The past was no longer a quiet companion, but a restless spectre demanding attention. Miss Marple observed the unfolding reactions with her usual quiet acuity. Faces that once bore gentle smiles now tightened with unease. Voices that had whispered polite greetings now faltered under the weight of suspicion. The chapel, once a symbol of sanctuary, had become the focal point of mystery and unease. Inspector Cray convened a meeting at the village hall, inviting all with a vested interest in the case. The room buzzed with murmurs, the tension palpable. Miss Marple took her seat near the back, allowing others to speak first while she absorbed the subtle shifts in demeanour. Julia Cartwright, poised yet visibly strained, addressed the assembly. These documents suggest a scandal, something that might explain the hostility toward Anne and perhaps the recent threats to Ellen. We must consider that someone among us fears exposure. A murmur of agreement was met with cautious glances. Amelia Farrow, seated stiffly at the side, cleared her throat. It is not only the scandal, but the betrayal of trust. Secrets buried in families can poison generations. Perhaps the violence we see is an echo of old sins. The inspector nodded. We are treating these findings as critical evidence. The question remains, who benefits most from keeping these secrets buried? As voices rose in debate, Miss Marple's gaze settled on Eleanor Marsh, the village postmaster, whose pale face and nervous hands betrayed her discomfort. Eleanor had been the one to discover the cryptic letter near the chapel. Though she offered little in the way of comment, Miss Marple sensed a guardedness that merited further attention. After the meeting, Miss Marple approached Eleanor gently. It must be difficult holding knowledge that weighs so heavily on the heart. Eleanor looked up, surprise flickering in her eyes before she masked it with a faint smile. Sometimes, Miss Marple, the truth is more frightening than any lie. Encouraged by the kindly tone, Eleanor confided in whispers about a whispered dispute she had overheard months before between a member of the Hepworth family and an unknown visitor, a disagreement veiled in threats and demands. The visitor, Eleanor believed, had been desperate to retrieve something from the estate, a secret that could unravel reputations. This revelation dovetailed with the letters referencing a clandestine liaison, suggesting a motive not only for Anne's disappearance, but for the attempted intimidation of Ellen. It became increasingly apparent that the murder was entwined with a tangled web of betrayal, pride, and fear. Miss Marple spent the following days moving quietly through the village, visiting homes and conversing with neighbours, gathering fragments of stories and observing reactions. She noted the careful avoidance of certain topics, the half-spoken warnings, and the nervous glances exchanged in private. At the village pub, under the guise of casual conversation, she spoke with Harold Benson, a local gardener known for his keen memory of village affairs. He recalled seeing Anne and a stranger near the chapel on several occasions before her disappearance, speaking in hushed tones with a mixture of urgency and fear. Anne was frightened, Harold said, stirring his ale thoughtfully. That much I'm sure of. Whatever she was involved with, it was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. Miss Marple gently pressed for details, but sensed that Harold, like many others, was reluctant to become entangled in matters best left alone. Back at the manor, tensions simmered as the household adjusted to the new revelations. Julia Cartwright's demeanour grew more guarded, and servants exchanged furtive whispers behind closed doors. Ellen's condition remained fragile, her silence a barrier to the truth, yet her presence a reminder of the stakes involved. One afternoon, as Miss Marple examined the letters anew, a subtle detail caught her eye. A small, almost imperceptible watermark on the paper. It was a mark associated with a particular stationery supplier in a neighbouring town, one known for discreet clientele and confidential correspondence. This clue suggested that the secret correspondence was intended to be hidden even from prying village eyes, pointing to the calculated nature of the conspiracy. Miss Marple shared her discovery with Inspector Cray, who agreed it warranted a discreet inquiry. The investigation extended beyond the village boundaries, tracing the provenance of the letters and the individuals connected to the supplier. Meanwhile, a new development added urgency to the case. A sudden fire broke out in the manor's west wing, narrowly contained by the quick actions of the fire brigade and villagers. The damage was superficial, yet the timing was suspicious. An apparent attempt to destroy evidence or silence those who knew too much. Miss Marple pondered the message behind the blaze. The arson was a desperate act, a flare signaling the perpetrator's increasing recklessness and fear. In the aftermath, Ellen Perkins, recovering enough to communicate through written notes, revealed a shocking confession. She admitted to overhearing a heated argument between Julia Cartwright and a mysterious visitor in the days before Anne's disappearance, an argument laced with threats and veiled accusations. This revelation shifted suspicions squarely onto Julia, but Miss Marple's instincts resisted the easy conclusion. There was too much at play, too many shadows dancing just beyond the flicker of the lamp. Late one evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, reflecting on the pieces of the puzzle laid bare. The letters, the threats, the fire, Ellen's silence, all threads in a tapestry woven with pain and duplicity. Her thoughts turned to the chapel, the heart of the village's secrets. The roots beneath its stones harboured more than history. They concealed the impetus for murder. Resolving to uncover the final truth, Miss Marple prepared to confront the tangled web of motives, knowing that the next step would be the most delicate of all. For in the quiet village of Little Whitting, the past was not dead. It was merely waiting to be unearthed. Miss Marple awoke with the dawn, the soft light filtering through the lace curtains revealing a village caught in the tentative embrace of morning calm. Yet beneath the tranquil surface, she sensed the village's collective heartbeat still raced from the storm of recent revelations. The fragile peace was but a thin veil, ready to be torn away by the slightest disturbance. With her customary quiet determination, she set about visiting those whose stories still held shadows, beginning with Julia Cartwright. The woman's composure had frayed visibly since the fire. A glance betrayed anxiety beneath her polished veneer. Julia greeted Miss Marple with a wary smile, as if uncertain whether the visitor was friend or foe. "Miss Marple," Julia began, voice measured, "I fear this investigation has unsettled more than just myself. It seems everyone here carries a burden they'd rather leave buried." Miss Marple nodded gently, choosing her words with care. "Burden or not, secrets have a curious way of revealing themselves, especially when they refuse to be ignored." Their conversation circled cautiously around the events leading up to Anne's disappearance, touching upon the contentious relationship between Julia and her late husband, Richard. Julia admitted the two had quarrelled bitterly in the weeks before. Anne vanished, yet insisted her frustrations had never escalated beyond words. I was angry, yes, Julia confessed. But murder? That is a chasm I could never cross. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Sometimes anger can be a mask for deeper fears or a shield against sorrow. As Julia spoke, Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in her hands, the slight tremor, the way her fingers clasped and unclasped. Small signs, perhaps, of a conscience wrestling with secrets yet unspoken. Leaving the manor, Miss Marple made her way to the village shop, where Eleanor Marsh was arranging the morning's deliveries. The postmaster's eyes brightened upon seeing her visitor, a glimmer of trust forming. "There is more, Miss Marple," Eleanor said quietly. "I have been thinking about that night in the chapel. Something didn't sit right with me then, and it bothers me still." Miss Marple encouraged her gently, prompting Eleanor to share her unease. It was the way the visitor spoke, Eleanor recalled, her voice barely above a whisper. Not just angry, but cold, calculated, like someone who believed themselves untouchable. Miss Marple nodded slowly, filing away the detail. "And did you notice anything peculiar about the visitor's appearance or mannerisms?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "A scar on the left hand, just below the wrist, and a slight limp. I only caught a glimpse, but it stayed with me." That detail sparked a memory in Miss Marple. A man fitting that description had been seen at the village inn days before the garden party, asking questions about the Hepworth family and the chapel grounds. The newcomer's name was never mentioned openly, but whispers had circulated about a Mr. Samuel Cross, a figure known for his ruthless business dealings in the neighbouring county. Miss Marple's mind pieced together a picture of a man who might benefit from the chaos unfolding in Little Whitting. If Samuel Cross had reason to unearth the Hepworth secrets, his presence could explain the threats and the desperate measures taken to silence Anne. Returning home, Miss Marple shared her suspicions with Inspector Cray, who agreed to pursue inquiries into Mr. Cross's background and recent activities. The inspector also tasked officers to discreetly monitor the village for any signs of the visitor's return. Days passed with little incident, though the villagers' nerves remained taut. Ellen Perkins's health improved gradually, her written notes growing more coherent, yet she remained reluctant to reveal the full extent of what she knew. Miss Marple respected Ellen's cautious approach, understanding that trauma often held truths locked behind fragile walls. One afternoon, while examining the chapel grounds, Miss Marple noticed a faint trail of footprints near the base of the altar, barely visible but unmistakably fresh. They led away from the building and toward the edge of the woodland. Intrigued, she followed the trail with deliberate steps, emerging into a small clearing where she found a discarded handkerchief embroidered with the initials J.C. The handkerchief was damp, as though dropped in haste. The discovery was a subtle but telling clue. Julia Cartwright had been near the chapel more recently than she had admitted. When Miss Marple mentioned the finding during a casual visit to the manor, Julia's composed facade faltered, a flicker of unease crossing her eyes. Later that evening, Miss Marple returned to the village pub, where she encountered Harold Benson once more. Their conversation drifted toward the complexities of human nature and the masks people wear. "Sometimes, Miss Marple," Harold mused, "it's not what people say that matters, but what they don't. The silence between words can be louder than any confession." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts aligned with his wisdom. "Indeed, Harold. And often it is in that silence that the truth waits patiently." As the sun set, casting long shadows over Little Whitting, Miss Marple felt the threads of the mystery tightening around her. The layers of deceit and fear were peeling away, revealing a core darker and more intricate than she had first imagined. She resolved that the next encounter would be decisive. The time had come to gently, yet firmly unsettle the suspects, to watch for the moment when guilt or innocence could no longer be concealed behind careful words and practiced expressions. For in a village such as this, where every face was familiar, yet every secret hidden, Miss Marple knew the truth was a delicate flower, one that would bloom only when carefully nurtured and patiently awaited. Miss Marple had spent the morning in quiet reflection, sitting by the window of her cosy sitting room where the gentle spring breeze fluttered the curtains. The village of Little Whitting lay serene beyond the glass, yet the calm was deceptive, like a still pond concealing currents beneath the surface. She felt the mystery closing in, as if the tangled web of secrets were about to unravel, thread by thread. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Inspector Cray, his usually composed manner edged with urgency. "Miss Marple, I've received a report from the county constabulary about a man fitting Mr. Cross's description," he said, stepping inside. "He was spotted near the outskirts of Malloby last night, behaving suspiciously." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That confirms my suspicions. Mr. Cross is no doubt more involved than he lets on. Has he been identified fully?" "Not yet, but officers are working on it. Meanwhile, I believe we should confront the people here once more. The tension has thickened, and the cracks in their stories are widening," Miss Marple agreed. "Very well. There is one more observation I wish to explore before we meet them again." Together, they visited the village chapel in daylight. The worn pews and faded stained glass cast a solemn atmosphere, yet the lingering sense of unrest was palpable. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the surroundings, settling once more on the handkerchief she had found, a silent witness to someone's hidden steps. "Inspector, I believe the key lies in the chapel's shadows," she murmured. "The person who dropped this handkerchief was clearly here not long ago, likely to conceal something or meet someone. And yet, why risk discovery by returning to such a visible spot?" Inspector Cray pondered the question. "Perhaps the chapel itself holds a secret we've overlooked," Miss Marple smiled gently. "Secrets often do." As the afternoon wore on, they convened at the village hall to speak with the principal figures: Julia Cartwright, Eleanor Marsh, Harold Benson, and a few others whose lives had been touched by the tragedy. The atmosphere was tense, but outwardly polite, the villagers watching one another with quiet suspicion. Miss Marple began with gentle inquiries, allowing the suspects to reveal themselves in their own words. Julia maintained a poised defense, though her eyes flickered with unease when questioned about the chapel visit. Eleanor appeared more nervous than before, clutching a handkerchief of her own, perhaps as a talisman. Her voice trembled when she admitted to hearing raised voices late at night, voices that did not belong to any known villagers. Harold was calm, almost too calm, speaking in measured tones that revealed a keen mind and a practiced control of emotion. When it came to discussing Samuel Cross, a shadow seemed to fall across the room. Julia's lips pressed thin, Eleanor's hands wrung the fabric nervously, and Harold's steady gaze never wavered. Miss Marple watched closely as a subtle game of glances and half-smiles played out. The village's polite veneer was cracking, exposing fragments of resentment, fear, and unspoken alliances. Later, as the meeting dispersed, Julia lingered behind, her voice low. "Miss Marple, I must confess, there is more I have not told you. About the night Anne disappeared, and about Samuel Cross." Intrigued, Miss Marple invited Julia to walk with her to the garden. There, beneath the budding branches of an old oak tree, Julia's composure faltered, revealing the woman beneath the surface. "Samuel Cross was not just a stranger," Julia began. "He was here years ago before Richard and I married. A man who threatened my family, demanding secrets we did not wish to reveal. When Richard confronted him recently, things turned ugly. But it was not Richard who harmed Anne. It was someone else, someone desperate to protect their own past." Miss Marple's mind raced, fitting this confession into the broader tapestry, the threats, the hidden histories, the shadows cast by old wounds. It was a complex design, with motives layered beneath motives. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple found herself back at her own hearth, the flickering firelight mirroring the flickers of insight in her mind. She knew the final test was near, that subtle psychological moment when the real culprit's mask would slip. In the quiet that followed, she prepared herself to engage with the suspects anew, to listen not just to their words, but to the silences and tremors that betrayed truth. For in a village like Little Whitting, where every smile could hide a secret and every gesture a lie, it was the unseen, the unspoken, that held the key to justice, and Miss Marple was ready to uncover it all. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains as Miss Marple sat quietly in her favourite armchair, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands. The peaceful village of Little Whitting, with its neatly trimmed hedges and blossoming gardens, seemed unchanged by the shadows that now lurked beneath its surface. Yet beneath this gentle exterior, the threads of deception and hidden motives were taut and ready to snap. The day ahead held promise and peril. Miss Marple had invited all those entangled in the mystery to gather once more, under the guise of a friendly tea at her cottage. It was here, in the cosy intimacy of her home, that she intended to conduct the final, delicate test. Her mind churned, quietly, assembling the pieces of the puzzle, calculating the precise moment to reveal the truth. As the clock chimed mid-morning, footsteps approached the door. Julia Cartwright arrived first, her composure as impeccable as ever, but with a faint trace of unease shadowing her gaze. Eleanor Marsh followed, clutching her embroidered handkerchief nervously, while Harold Benson entered last, his expression inscrutable. Miss Marple greeted each with gentle warmth, offering a soft smile that belied the steely resolve beneath. "Thank you all for coming," she said, motioning them to sit. "I thought it best we share a quiet moment, away from the prying eyes of the village." The room was small but inviting, with floral upholstery and the faint scent of freshly baked scones. As the guests settled, Miss Marple's keen eyes took in every detail. Julia's restless fingers, Eleanor's darting glances, Harold's careful posture. She began with casual conversation, weaving threads of everyday life into the dialogue, but beneath her calm tone lay a subtle probing. "Julia, you mentioned a confrontation with Samuel Cross. It must have been distressing to find him here after so many years. How did Richard react to this unwelcome visitor?" Julia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Richard was angry, yes, protective of our family, but he wanted to handle it quietly. He feared that any scandal would tear our lives apart. And yet," Miss Marple continued softly, "Anne's disappearance has cast a long shadow. Do you believe there is a connection between these events?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "I do, but I cannot say how. There are things I have kept hidden, things I thought forgotten." Eleanor shifted in her seat. "I overheard voices in the chapel that night," she blurted, her cheeks flushing. "They spoke of secrets and debts. I thought it was just idle gossip, but now I'm not so sure." Harold's steady voice broke in. "Secrets and debts can drive people to desperate measures, but it is easy to point fingers when one does not know the full story." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, Harold, knowing the full story is the challenge we all face. Sometimes the truth lies not in the loud declarations, but in the quiet moments we overlook." Her gaze settled on Julia, then Eleanor, then Harold, watching for the smallest flicker of recognition or guilt. After a brief pause, Miss Marple rose gracefully. "I have one more thing to share." She moved to a small cabinet and produced the handkerchief found at the chapel, holding it out gently. "This belonged to someone who was at the chapel that night. "Whose is it?" The room grew still. Julia's face paled. Eleanor's hands trembled. Harold's eyes flickered ever so slightly. I don't know," Julia said, voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor swallowed hard, then spoke. "It is not mine. Perhaps it belongs to someone who did not want to be seen." Miss Marple nodded, then turned her attention to Harold. "You were seen near the chapel that night, Harold. What took you there?" Harold's eyes met hers steadily. "I went to speak with Anne. We had an arrangement, a secret that, if revealed, could have destroyed more than one reputation. And yet," Miss Marple pressed, "Anne did not live to reveal that secret." "Why?" The room was charged with tension. Eleanor suddenly gasped, covering her mouth. "It wasn't Harold, it wasn't him." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet triumph. "Ah, Eleanor, sometimes fear clouds our judgment. The truth is rarely as simple as we wish." Slowly, the pieces aligned in her mind. The motives, the fear of exposure, the desperation to protect, fragile reputations, all intertwined in a lethal knot. Miss Marple's voice softened, yet carried an undeniable authority. "Julia, Eleanor, Harold, each of you had reasons to keep certain truths buried, but only one could have silenced Anne. Forever." She stepped closer, her gaze locking with Julia's. "Julia, it was you who feared the past catching up, the family name stained by Samuel Cross's threats. You met Anne at the chapel demanding her silence." Julia's composure shattered, tears spilling freely. "I did not mean to. I only wanted her to stop talking, to leave us be." And in that moment, Miss Marple continued, fear overtook reason, and tragedy occurred. Julia sank into her chair, the weight of guilt palpable. The room exhaled a collective breath, the tension easing but leaving an indelible mark. Inspector Cray, who had quietly entered during the confession, stepped forward to take Julia into custody. Miss Marple sat back, a gentle sadness touching her features. The village would slowly heal, but the scars of hidden sins remained. As the door closed behind the inspector and Julia, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea, reflecting on the fragile nature of human secrets and the quiet strength it took to unearth them. In Little Whitting, as in all places, the truth had finally come to light, not with loud accusations, but with patient observation and a compassionate heart. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Miss Marple's sitting room as the last of the day's visitors departed, their faces etched with the weariness of revelations and regrets. The village of Little Whitting had settled back into its familiar quietude, but beneath the surface, an uneasy stillness lingered, one born of truths finally spoken and the fragile restoration of order. Miss Marple sat by the window, her knitting, resting in her lap as her thoughts traced the delicate threads that had woven this tangled tapestry of deceit and despair. The puzzle had been complex, but the pieces had fallen neatly into place, each character's motives and fears laid bare with quiet precision. Julia Cartwright's confession had come as no surprise to Miss Marple. The sharp glint of fear in her eyes, the subtle defensiveness beneath her composed exterior, and the secret burdens she carried, all had whispered the truth long before words were spoken. Yet it was not hatred or malice alone that had driven her to such desperate action. It was the fear of losing everything she cherished, the panic of watching her carefully constructed life unravel under the weight of Samuel Cross's threats. Anne, Pritchard, though young and seemingly gentle, had held dangerous knowledge that could have shattered reputations and upended lives. Her fate was the tragic consequence of a clash between secrets too heavy to bear and the human frailty that succumbs to fear. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile as she recalled the subtle clues that had guided her. Eleanor's overheard voices, The misplaced handkerchief, Harold's ambiguous visits to the chapel, and Julia's restless hands. Each detail, insignificant alone, had together formed a quiet chorus of truth waiting to be heard. Her reflections were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Inspector Cray, his expression a mixture of respect and gratitude. "Miss Marple, I must thank you. Without your insight, this case would have remained a frustrating tangle. The village owes you a great debt." She nodded kindly. "The pleasure is mine, Inspector. Sometimes it is in the smallest details and the quietest observations that the greatest truths reside." As the evening deepened and shadows lengthened, Miss Marple rose and moved to her mantelpiece, where a framed photograph of the village green reminded her of the delicate balance of peace and turmoil that marked small-town life. She knew the scars left by this tragedy would linger, yet she took comfort in the resilience of the people and the enduring power of truth. In Little Whitting, life would continue, marked now by the knowledge that even the most serene places held secrets, and that it was only with patience, compassion, and keen observation that justice could prevail. With that comforting thought, Miss Marple settled back into her chair, the steady ticking of the clock a gentle reminder that time, like truth, moves inevitably forward.